that font of poetry that is your own soul will forever be giving you these metaphors to help you understand who you are, why you're here, and why you chose to come be here in this existence. Hello and welcome back to Remember Why You're Here, a podcast for seekers and sensitives where you can relax, receive, reconnect to yourself, and remember that most important thing of all, why you're here. I'm Asia Suler, author, earth intuitive, teacher. And in this episode today, we're going to talk about something that I just love. It's just one of these things that I love talking about, and that is the metaphor of your soul. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to connect to your own soul, why we can tend to miss some of our soul's communications, the way in which our soul communicates with us. And we're going to learn how to read the language of our souls. You're going to learn how to communicate with your own soul, your own wider self. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who has joined me over on Substack, the Remember Why You Are Here Substack. It has been really special to dive into that space there, to get to know some of you there. For everyone who has become a paid member and has been able to access some of those paid posts and meditations, it really just has meant the world to me. It's so supportive for me and for the podcast. And I just really want to take a moment on this day, this August day, to thank you all so much. This community that has gathered around Remember Why You're Here is really just so special, and I feel honored to be a part of it. So if you're interested in longer writings about each one of these video podcast episodes, or if you want to access some of that paid content like meditations and classes, you can head on over to Remember Why You're Here over on Substack, and I'll place that link here in the show notes if you're interested. Okay, so let's get into our episode for today. First, let's talk about what I mean when I say the word soul, because this is one of those poetic words that people use in a lot of different ways. So here's how I define soul. I define soul as our own wider self. Some people like the term higher self. I like the term wider self because it's something we're a part of. Our soul is the essential essence of who we are, the wider light from which we come. Our soul is its own individual entity with its own qualities and characteristics. And our soul sends part of itself to this lifetime, to this place and this time to live out an experience inside of our bodies here on this planet. So our soul is the part of us that is beyond this lifetime, that encompasses all lifetimes, that is, sort of the truest essence of who we are in connection with our widest self, our widest knowing. So our soul is our self with a capital S. This is where we come from. This is our ultimate guide. This is something we're always a part of. We never leave. We can never depart from our own soul. We are always connected to our own soul. We are a part of our own soul. And our soul is really like the ultimate spirit guide in this lifetime, because your soul knows why you came here, what you are planning to do. Our souls can remind us of why we are here, which we all need reminding of every once in a while. So being able to be in communication with your soul is really about being able to be in communication with your own widest knowing, your own widest self, with the part of you that sees that big picture, that knows innately who you are, and that trusts beyond all doubt that you are loved absolutely and unconditionally exactly as you are. Your soul understands your destiny. Your soul is holding all of the blueprints for all of the unfoldings that are possible for you in this lifetime. I just love this term soul to me. I mean, literally, it's so soulful. And so I love this concept of connecting with our soul as a way to connect with this wider self. So why do we sometimes miss communications from our soul? So our soul is always communicating with us. We don't come to this planet and then we're just like without any guidance or help. We never lose that connection to our soul. It's impossible to actually sever that connection. And so we're constantly receiving information, communication, and support from our soul, this wider part of us that wants to help us on our journey, wants to help us, remember why we're here, continue down the path. Why do we sometimes miss these communications if they're happening all the time? Well, this is why our soul most often speaks in metaphor. This is one reason why I'm calling this podcast The Metaphor of Your Soul. So, our soul likes to speak in what we call metaphor. So, just to define metaphor here, so we're all on the same page, metaphor is a figure of speech that compares two different things by saying one thing is actually the other or actually like the other. If you want to get technical here with metaphor, we don't typically use like or as. That would be a simile, but you get the picture. Metaphor is comparing one thing to another. It is a way in language to express a concept that is inexpressible directly. So, if you gaze into your child's eyes and they're so beautiful, you feel like you're whisked away. You'd be like, her eyes, like I think about my child when she had been recently born, I was like, her eyes are like as deep as lochs. Her eyes are like these deep water lakes of Scotland. Like I remember saying that to someone, like, oh, her eyes, like they're as deep as lochs, as deep as these lakes. And so I'm using, in this instance, this is technically a simile, but stay with me here. We're just using metaphor as an overarching concept, but we're using something to reference and express something that's inexpressible, that's actually bigger than direct words can fully capture. And it's only through making connection between those two things or between those set of things that we can start to grasp the totality of something that exists beyond the grasp of our language. And this is the language that our soul speaks in. This is the language that our soul has to speak in. Why? Because our soul remembers and sees the big picture. Our souls knows, your soul knows who you've been in every lifetime, understands all the mysteries of existence, all the mysteries that we come here and purposely forget. And so imagine you're a being that understands the widest view of reality, all of life's mysteries, the mysteries of the universe, and you're trying to communicate to someone who has a language, whether you're talking about actual literal spoken language or just the language that's accessible in our brains, the language of how we view things, being in a body that is much, much, much more limited. How do you do this? How do you express something that is literally beyond, in some ways, our ability to grasp in this lifetime? And that's for a purpose, right? We come here, we place the veil of forgetting on, so we forget who we are and where we come from. That's like part of the fun. I'm doing some air quotes, part of the fun of being here. It's part of the it's part of the story. It's part of the experience. But how do we then guide this part of ourselves? How would a soul, how would a wider self guide then this part of us that purposely is here to be disconnected from that wider view? Well, you have to speak in metaphor. You have to speak in a way that references, that helps that person grasp the bigger reality from which you're communicating. So our soul can communicate with us in our dreams, through signs and synchronicities, through inner nudgings, gut feelings, intuitions, things other people say to us. But why we often miss it is that we miss that the language is one of metaphor, that we're actually not looking for. It's that most often it's not super direct messages. Sometimes this can happen for people, especially if you are, claircognizant, if that's how you receive. But for most people, the soul speaks in metaphor. And, one of the things about metaphors is that they capture layers of reality. A metaphor can have several meanings at once. For example, if I talked about my daughter's eyes and I said, they were dark and deep, you're like, okay, dark and deep. But if I say they were as dark and mysterious and fathomless as a deep loch, It's like there are layers of meaning there, right? There's depth, there's mystery, there's profundity. There's that edge of the unknown. There's the connotations that we have with the word loch, especially if you're not Scottish. We think about the Loch Ness monster, like we think about these like deep mysteries of existence, like the complete unknown. And so when I say that, I'm like referencing a truth and a reality that is so much more vibrant and complex and multi-layered than if I would just say her eyes were dark and deep. And so this is why our soul likes to speak in metaphor, because it can hold more layers of meaning, and it's closer to the truth of the reality from which our soul is communicating, which is this wider reality that is beyond our language's ability to directly conceptually grasp. Another really beautiful thing about metaphors, and why I think it's our soul's preferred method of communication, is the way in which metaphors create connection and create relationship. Relationship is at the most basic level of this reality of our planet. We come here to experience having a self, like an individuated self. What an interesting concept. And then through having this self, be able to encounter others in relationship. It's a very creative process of individuation, separation, and then being able to relate. How does this relationship work? What happens in the in between? And so, because we come here on this planet to have relationship, the beautiful part of metaphor is that it automatically creates connection. It creates relationship. It's comparing two things. This is like this. Well, how are these two things similar? If this is its own entity and this is its own entity, well, then where do these two places meet? It gets our brains starting to think in the language of relationships and connection, which is really where all healing and revelation and realization happen. And just through deciding to look more for the metaphor, to embrace metaphor more fully in your life, you're coming into deeper connection as well with your own soul. You're developing and deepening that relationship. It's a very handy tool, right, to describe the indescribable. And on, I think, maybe perhaps the most poetic level of why our soul likes to speak in metaphor, it's because we are living inside of a metaphor on this planet. If you think about it, if you break it down, if you think about this concept of a metaphor as, you know, sort of using language and a construct to compare it to something, to reference something greater. It's like a microcosm of the macrocosm. Like, you're comparing these two things so you can see the bigger whole. Well, all of reality is a metaphor for wider existence. The physical reality, this is all a manifestation of a metaphor for a wider existence that we can't fully capture in words, and that we will never fully know while we are embodied in this lifetime. That's, like I said, that's part of the fun. That's part of the experience. And so leaning into metaphor is also leaning into the nature of reality. All of your life is a metaphor for the wider journey of your soul, the wider journey of your soul's own evolution and expression. So everything that also is happening in your life is referencing as well this wider journey and this wider expression in your soul's wider unfolding, which is so much bigger than even just this one individual lifetime. So of course, our soul's going to love to use metaphor for that reason as well, because it helps attune us to the metaphor of reality and start to see, even in sort of what we might perceive as the most simplistic or direct aspects of reality or mundane aspects of reality, this reference to the spirit of things, this reference to the unseen, this reference to something greater. So this, as I said, can come up in a lot of ways, but I've been thinking about this a lot recently as I've been getting back into doing more intuitive work, more one-on-one intuitive work, and really noticing how I've always worked in images, and you'll see that throughout my monthly intuitive readings, but just how important the metaphors of those images are, and that the deeper I go into the metaphor that I'm given, the more layers will unveil itself. So here's just a little example. I was giving a reading for someone the other day, and I was shown a waterfall. And, I could be very straightforward. I could be like, "Oh, do you live by a waterfall? Are you going to travel to a waterfall?" And, that those wouldn't be like incorrect, right? But I understand that the soul speaks in metaphor. And in this reading, I was specifically connecting to this person's soul. And so I understood that this was a metaphor. And because it was being given to me, I also knew that their soul was using a lexicon or a dictionary of images that would help me to make sense of that. So for me, I think of waterfalls as times of, intensity, where time moves faster, changes might happen kind of quickly, where there's like a big shift from where you were to where you're going. It was time of like identity change, like literally a river's flowing and the waterfall happens, and that's a rupture, a shift. And so I was going through all these layers of meaning in my own life and in my own understanding, and then communicating that to her. And it really stood out to me how, if I hadn't thought of the metaphor of waterfalls and how I know waterfalls, what waterfalls evoke inside of me, I would have really missed some important messages for her, and for, the way in which her soul is communicating to her about what was going on in her life right now, which was a lot of change, which I didn't know about. So, how do you speak the language of your soul then? How do you start to speak the language of your soul in this way? Well, there is an importance here, right, in putting on our poet's cap, to start viewing life from this as if you were a poet, understanding that we are all poets in this existence, and really starting to, think about things metaphorically, to, open up to the creativity that might be there, that expression, instead of going beyond just, the immediate direct response, and opening our mind. There's a really beautiful saying that a good poem is like a net. What makes the poem is not the rope itself, but the space in between. I've always loved this so much. And so there's also this piece of leaving space in between, when maybe you receive a message, or have a dream, or you experience a synchronicity or sign in your life, to give it space to breathe, to understand that, like, there's so much meaning that can be relayed in just that one image or just that one experience. And so, to realize that we make the connections that we need to make often when we give ourselves that space. So, ways in which you can give yourself space. And then, as I was talking about with the waterfall image that came to me in this reading, you developing your own lexicon of images and metaphors is going to be important. What does this mean for you? Because, and I say this a lot when I talk about dream work, but I think it's important in any intuitive work and in connecting with our own souls. Our souls, our wider self, they're going to communicate to us through our associations, through our life experiences, through, the poetry of what we have experienced. And so notice what appears to you again and again, and what that means to you. What is your association with waterfall? You might have done that reading differently, or if your own wider self gave you that image, if you asked for an image and you were given that image, or you asked a question and you received that, what would that mean to you? Maybe you did have a waterfall in a park nearby growing up, and you had a formative experience in that park, and so it's going to bring that up for you. Your own wider self will use that beautiful bank of wisdom and knowledge to create the most perfect metaphor. Our souls are very creative in this way. They love creating beautiful metaphors for us to step into and to unpack and to see the layers of. So, start to notice that. Notice reoccurring themes in your dreams. What shows up again and again. And what is cool is that the more we start to tune in to those metaphors, the more we can sort of go past the first layer of communication and start to receive the additional layers. So here's an example. Over the years, I've noticed that cars have a very specific meaning in my dreams. Now, I'm not a car person. Like, if you ask me what car someone drives in my life, I probably don't know. Like, I probably can't name the make or the model. I could probably name the color maybe. But so I'm not very attuned to cars. So I know this about myself. So it was really interesting to me when I started having very specific dreams where cars figure prominently. And I realized pretty quickly that these dreams where there is a car, normally I'm in the back seat. And that is signaling to me, like, Asia, you're not in the driver's seat right now. There's actually someone else who's communicating to you right now through this dream. So it started with my several different grandparents of mine coming and driving the car, being in the front seat. I've had other dreams where living people are in the front seat, but I always know that when there's a car, it means that there's this is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for a message that's trying to come through. And if I'm in the back seat, it often means that it's someone else, another consciousness coming in to communicate something to me. That's a visitation, so pay attention. And then, once I understood this, then, my own wider self and my guides, my ancestors started using the car in creative ways. So there would be, issues in different parts of the car that would alert me to issues in different parts of my body, for example. So the more you can tune into your own lexicon of images, the more that dictionary will get deeper, and you'll have more words, right? It's like there'll be more words to express the poem. So start to write these down. Start to notice, maybe you always see cardinals, start to just note that. How do you feel when you see the cardinal, and what comes up for you? What is that connected to for you? Or, maybe recently you've just been seeing rainbows everywhere. Take note of that. This is you developing your own spirit dictionary. And so once you become aware of this, then it's going to be easier to understand and receive these messages. Also, a really important thing with poetry in general, including the poetry of our own souls and these metaphors that come through, is to notice how you feel. Good poetry is not, in my opinion, about the expertise of how words are used. That's fun. That can be part of the creative process. But good poetry is good because you feel something. You don't even need to know what the poem is about. You don't have to understand why the poet created every single line. You just need to know that you're feeling something. And the same is true with the metaphors that are being sent from our own soul. The same is true with this information that is coming in from our own wider selves. Notice what you feel. Tune into what you feel. Notice in life what has a feeling tone for you. You could drive past a beautiful elm on the street and, every time you pass it, just have a feeling. Someone else could drive past it and literally never notice that tree. But you have a feeling every time you drive past it. Notice that feeling tone. Notice what gives you goosebumps, what makes you stop, what strikes you as particularly beautiful. These are all parts of this lexicon of the metaphors that your soul will use to communicate with you. So, these are all ways in which our soul will come in and gift us messages, again, in dreams, through signs, through synchronicities. But we can also ask, keep asking, ask for dreams, ask for a sign or synchronicity in your life. This is part of the rules of existence, is that we need to ask. So ask and then be open. Ask and put on that poet's cap, put the feather in your cap, whatever you like to use here, whatever metaphor makes sense for you, and see what metaphor comes in. I even like doing these metaphorical walks where I ask a question and then I do a walk in nature and I just see who shows up, what appears to me, and what appears in a way where then I have an emotion or a feeling come up. And I know that this is part of the metaphors of what is being expressed to me, what is being shared with me. After I take these walks, I often will come back and I just write whatever it is that stood out to me. Writing is a really good tool to translate what might come in and feel like a little nebulous, and to translate it into reality. And so some of you might be very clairvoyant. You might really see these images, but for a lot of us, it's actually more of like a feeling sense. Like, I feel like I'm sitting by a waterfall, for example. Or, I in the case of this walk, a branch fell down, and I felt this swooping feeling inside of me that actually felt very liberating. So again, like a feeling sense inside of you. So it might come in more as that. Sometimes people are more clairaudient. They might like hear something, hear song lyrics, or hear like a snippet of poetry in connection with something. But all of this is metaphorical. So when you come back from this walk, in this specific example, sit down and write down whatever occurred to you, especially if it had a feeling tone, and just like free associate. That free association, like this is often the poetry that I love the most. It makes these really beautiful leaps. Again, this idea of like a good poem being like a good net. What makes it a good net is the space in between. They make these leaps, and in the leap part, that's where all the beauty happens. We go from this to this, and whoa, something just happened inside of me. And so when we free associate after, for example, going on one of these walks, I call them oracle walks often, if going on an oracle walk, asking a question, and then you come home and you just free associate, you know, whatever happened, note it down, free associate. You get free association, just that idea, that thing, that image, those words, that is you creating poetry. That is you grasping the more metaphorical meaning behind what you just experienced. And how will you know that you have like really hit on your soul's meaning or the intent behind that metaphor? It'll be a feeling. There will be like a feeling of like peace, but also like rightness and excitement. It's like a feeling of settledness, but also expansion at the same time. And so just start to notice and like chart your feelings. And sometimes we kind of have to catch ourselves like a little unaware, because our brain can want to insert itself and overthink things. And this is why I love things like walking, and the free association writing, also dreaming, because it kind of puts our conscious mind a little bit in that back seat and it allows us to be a little more open. So sometimes people ask me this question of like, how do I know it's not, my conscious mind? Or, really it's more of like, how do I know it's not my like worried mind, my fearful mind, my anxiety coming in? Well, because normally those associations or those messages will come in with a feeling of fear, urgency, criticism, judgment, and that's how we know that that's our brain trying to control the message, control the situation, trying to protect us from danger. And like, God bless our brain. That's our brain has a purpose. And in this instance, we want to free ourselves. This is why we're putting on the poet's cap. It's not about, figuring it out. That's not the energy behind poetry. That's not the energy behind metaphor. It's about experiencing it. It's about being open to like the wonder of the layers of meaning inherent to, that one single metaphor. Ultimately, your soul itself is also this beautiful metaphor for an inexplicable level of reality. For, you know, your soul is unique and entire unto itself, and it is referencing this reality of the divine that, we in our lifetimes are here to experience, mostly through a veil, through, these interesting layers of being here in a body and being here on this planet. But your soul is poetry in that way, contains poetry. The poem of who you are is whole and intact and can never be diminished, can never be destroyed. And that font of poetry that is your own soul will forever be giving you these metaphors to help you understand who you are, why you're here, and why you chose to come be here in this existence. So there's this really beautiful quote from the movie Bright Star that is attributed to John Keats in one of his letters. And the quote that I love goes like this: "A poem needs understanding through the senses. The point of diving in a lake is not immediately to swim to the shore, but to be in the lake, to luxuriate in the sensation of water. You do not work the lake out. It is an experience beyond thought. Poetry soothes and emboldens the soul to accept mystery." And I think ultimately this is why our soul communicates with us through metaphor, because our own soul is soothing and emboldening us to accept the mystery of reality, to orient ourselves to the fact that the point of being here on this planet is not to figure it out, but to be in the lake, to be in the experience, to, be here and in whatever way we can luxuriate in the sensation of water, the sensation, the experience of being here that is temporal, that is brief, that is something our soul was really interested in experiencing. And so we wade into the lake, and here we are in the midst experiencing it. And our soul is simply, asking us to be here in the midst of the mystery of it all and know that there is meaning. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here on this planet, for all of the beauty that you are pouring into this world. I do have a big announcement, which is that I have officially started doing intuitive readings again. I'm opening my books for this fall for one-on-one intuitive readings, and I'm calling these readings Your Soul's Image, because what I was directed to do was to open my books to do these intuitive readings. And through these readings, I bring in an image from your soul for you that will help you connect to your own soul and your own wider self. Along with that image, I also call in and we meet one of your guides, as well as answer some of your questions about your life. So I'm about to open my books for this next week. And I have a feeling they're going to go really fast. So if you're interested in booking one of these readings, you can sign up for the wait list below in order to receive first word when they open. And I'm only going to be opening a couple months at a time. So I will open more sessions later this fall if you were not able to get in this time around. But that is coming up next week. So go ahead and get on that wait list if you're interested. And I would be so honored to help you connect with your own wider self, to connect you with the metaphor of your soul. So thank you so much for being here. It's really such an honor to be walking with you on this path as we move into the times ahead, the deep times, the deep lake of time. May all of the poetry, the metaphor that comes your way help you open up this connection to your own soul's knowing, to your own unique energy, the possibilities that are here for you in this lifetime, and may it help you remember that most important thing of all, why you're here.